March 17, 1943. North Atlantic, 430 nautical miles southwest of Iceland. Mechaniker Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed his ear against the cold steel pressure hull of U-260, listening. The 23-year-old engine mechanic from Hamburg had developed a skill during 8 months at sea that no training manual could teach. He could hear death approaching through water. The distinctive splash pattern had begun 90 seconds earlier. 5 depth charges, dropped in the standard British pattern. Now came the waiting. Zimmermann counted silently, his lips moving. 7 seconds meant the charges were set for 50 meters. 12 seconds meant 100 meters. 20 seconds meant 200 meters. He reached 22 seconds, then 25. The explosions, when they finally came, were distant thunder rather than the crushing hammer blows that killed submarines. The boat shuddered slightly. Paint chips drifted down from overhead pipes. The lights flickered but held. Zimmermann looked at Oberleutnant zur See Hubertus Perkhold, U-260's commander, and saw the same realization dawning on both their faces. The British destroyer hunting them had set its depth charges for 200 feet, approximately 60 meters. U-260 was running at 300 meters, nearly 100 meters deeper than the weapons exploding overhead. They were, quite literally, beneath the reach of death. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Zimmermann would survive the war and spend 40 years as a marine engineer in Hamburg's shipyards. In a 1987 interview, his memory of that moment remained crystalline. We realized in that instant that the ocean had layers the enemy didn't fully understand. Their weapons were searching for us in the wrong depth. It was like hiding in a basement while someone searched the second floor. What Zimmermann and thousands of other German submariners discovered in early 1943 was a temporary tactical advantage born from the intersection of technology, physics, and doctrine. Allied depth charges, the primary anti-submarine weapons of the war's first years, operated within depth parameters that German submarine designers had exceeded. The physics of underwater explosions created a three-dimensional battlefield where depth provided sanctuary as surely as distance. This advantage would prove fleeting. By late 1943, Allied forces had recognized the problem and implemented solutions. But for approximately 9 months, from late 1942 through mid-1943, German U-boat commanders who understood the mathematics of deep diving possessed a survival tool that statistics alone cannot capture. The story of depth charges set too shallow intersects with broader narratives of the Battle of the Atlantic, technological race between submarine and anti-submarine forces, the human cost of incremental advantages, and the brutal education both sides received in the physics of underwater warfare. It reveals how warfare's most decisive factors often involve not revolutionary innovations but the mundane details of weapon settings, training standards, and tactical doctrine. The British Mark VII depth charge, standard weapon of Royal Navy escorts through 1943, was a 300-pound canister filled with 290 pounds of Minol explosive. The weapon's design dated to 1940, with incremental improvements through 1942. Its fundamental operating principle was straightforward: sink at a predetermined rate, detonate at a preset depth via hydrostatic pistol, and destroy submarines through shockwave transmission through water. The physics seemed sound. Water, being incompressible, transmitted shock waves efficiently, a depth charge exploding within. 20 feet of a submarine's pressure hull would crush it. Explosions within 50 feet would cause catastrophic damage. Even detonations 100 feet distant could crack welds, rupture pipes, and disable equipment. British anti-submarine doctrine, developed through decades of naval experience and refined during World War I, assumed submarines operated at modest depths. Historical data supported this assumption. In the Great War, German U-boats rarely exceeded 150 feet during attacks. Their maximum diving depth, limited by primitive hull construction, was approximately 250 feet, with most commanders refusing to exceed 175 feet due to safety concerns. When war resumed in 1939, the Royal Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division based its tactical planning on these historical precedents. Standard depth charge settings ranged from 50 feet to 150 feet, with 200 feet considered the extreme deep setting. Escort commanders were trained to drop patterns with charges set to different depths, creating a three-dimensional kill zone. The first indication that this doctrine faced challenges came from an unexpected source: German prisoners of war. After U-570 surrendered intact to British forces in August 1941, technical examination revealed the boat's maximum diving depth far exceeded British assumptions. The Type VIIC submarine, backbone of the German U-boat fleet, had an official maximum operating depth of 220 meters, approximately 720 feet. Royal Navy engineers were stunned. Their depth charges couldn't reach anywhere near such depths. Even the deepest setting, 200 feet, left a massive sanctuary zone where submarines could hide beyond weapon reach. Subsequent interrogations of U-boat prisoners confirmed that experienced commanders routinely exceeded 300 feet when under attack, and some boats had survived at depth approaching 400 feet. The intelligence reached operational commanders slowly. Naval bureaucracy, combined with skepticism about prisoner testimony, delayed recognition of the problem. Many escort commanders simply didn't believe submarines could operate at such depths. The assumption that German boats would implode below 250 feet remained widespread through early 1943. Klaus Zimmermann's experience aboard U-260 illustrated both the advantage and its limitations. The boat, a Type VIIC commissioned in October 1942, departed Kristiansand, Norway, on March 8, 1943, bound for patrol areas south of Iceland. The crew of 46 men, average age 23, included 17 on their first combat patrol. Commander Perkhold, 31 years old, was a veteran of 5 previous patrols. He had developed tactics based on careful observation of Allied attack patterns. His standing orders to the control room crew were: explicit when depth charges began falling, take the boat to 280 meters immediately, regardless of the boat's rated limits. The reasoning was mathematical. British destroyers typically attacked at 15 knots, approaching a submerged contact detected by ASDIC sonar. The destroyer would lose sonar contact when range closed below 200 yards due to equipment limitations. At that point, the ship would steam over the submarine's last known position and drop a pattern of depth charges set to various depths. The entire attack run took approximately 3 minutes from initial approach to weapon release. During those 3 minutes, an experienced U-boat commander could order emergency deep diving procedures. The submarine would flood ballast tanks, angle the hydroplanes to maximum down position, and drive deeper using electric motors at full power. A Type VIIC could descend at approximately 3 meters per second under emergency procedures, 180 meters per minute. From periscope depth of 15 meters, the boat could reach 280 meters in approximately 90 seconds, assuming the crew executed flawlessly and the boat's systems held. The tactical equation was simple. If depth charges were set for 200 feet, 60 meters, and the submarine reached 300 meters depth, a vertical separation of 240 meters existed nearly 800 feet. At that distance, even a direct overhead explosion posed minimal threat. Zimmermann's patrol report, discovered in German naval archives in 1994, documented 16 separate depth charge attacks during U-260's 32-day patrol. In 12 of these attacks, the submarine successfully dove below 250 meters before weapons detonated. Zimmermann noted the progression of each attack: the initial ASDIC pings striking the hull, the sound of destroyer propellers overhead, the splashes of depth charges entering water, and finally the explosions. His engineering logs recorded damage from these attacks with clinical precision. Attack number 4, March 17th, the incident described in the opening. Minor structural damage, no casualties, battery acid spillage minimal. Attack number 7, March 20th 1st, moderate damage to stern torpedo tube. 2 men injured by falling equipment. air leaks in multiple hull penetrations, requiring repair. What emerges from these records is a pattern. Shallow set depth charges, those exploding above 200 feet, caused minimal damage to deeply submerged submarines. The shock waves dissipated rapidly with distance, especially when traveling through different thermal layers in the water that bent and weakened the pressure waves. Not all U-boats enjoyed such success. The tactic of diving deep required boats in good mechanical condition, experienced crews capable of executing emergency procedures flawlessly, and commanders with the nerve to push their submarines beyond official depth limits. Many boats lacked one or more of these elements. U-409, operating in the same general area as U-260 during March 1943, attempted the deep diving tactic on March 22nd. The boat, suffering from mechanical problems after months of hard patrol duty, descended to 270 meters when the stern glands seals around the propeller shafts failed catastrophically. Seawater flooded the aft compartments. The boat plunged to 400 meters before the crew regained control through emergency blow procedures. U-409 surfaced in the midst of the attacking convoy, was immediately shelled by escorts, and sank with 48 men lost. The depth advantage worked only for boats whose hull integrity remained sound. German submarine construction used welded seams rather than riveted construction, providing strength advantages but also creating potential failure points. Each dive beyond rated depth stressed these welds. Microscopic cracks would develop, weakening the structure incrementally. A boat might survive 10 deep dives, then fail catastrophically on the 11th. Oberleutnant Zur C. Werner Henke, commanding U-515, exploited the depth advantage more systematically than perhaps any other commander. Between November 1942 and April 1943, U-515 completed 2 extraordinarily successful patrols to the Caribbean and South Atlantic, sinking 25 merchant ships totaling over 136,000 tons. Henke's tactical approach, documented in his patrol reports and later described in post-war interrogations, involved aggressive surface attacks, followed by deep crash dives when escorts responded. His standing order to the diving crew was to reach 300 meters within 2 minutes of the alarm. U-515's crew drilled this maneuver repeatedly until they achieved it consistently. During his second patrol, February through April 1943, U-515 survived 31 separate depth charge attacks. Henke's patrol report noted that in 27 of these attacks, depth charges exploded well above the boat's position, causing no significant damage. Only 4 attacks, conducted by American escorts using newer weapons with deeper settings, caused moderate damage requiring repair at sea. The statistics from this period reveal the tactical advantage's scope. German naval records, compiled from patrol reports and post-action analysis, indicate that between November 1942 and May 1943, submarines that successfully dove below 250 meters during depth charge attacks had a survival rate of 87%. Submarines remaining at shallower depths either through mechanical inability or commander decision had a survival rate of 43%. These numbers represented thousands of lives. Each percentage point of survival rate translated to dozens of submariners who lived or died based on depth management during attacks. The mathematics were brutal, but clear depth provided sanctuary when weapons couldn't reach you. The human experience of deep diving under attack involved terror that statistics cannot capture. Every meter beyond rated depth brought the submarine closer to implosion. The hull would groan continuously, a low moaning sound that set teeth on edge. Rivets would pop with sounds like pistol shots. Water would jet through tiny cracks in the hull, streams no thicker than pencils but propelled by tremendous pressure. The crew would hear all of this while simultaneously listening to depth charges exploding overhead. The sound of explosions travelled through water, then through the steel hull, then through the air inside the boat. Each detonation arrived as 3 distinct impacts. First, the pressure wave through the hull, felt as much as heard, then the acoustic wave through the air, and finally the shock wave through the water again, as it reflected off the lined surface and returned. Men would grip stanchions or press themselves against bulkheads, trying to absorb the shock. The motion was violent. The boat would lift bodily when a close explosion occurred, then slam back down, tossing anyone not braced off their feet. Light bulbs would shatter in their sockets. Canned goods would fall from storage racks. Battery acid would slosh in the cells, occasionally spilling and releasing chlorine gas that burned lungs and eyes. The psychological strain was cumulative. Mechaniker Hans Schaefer, serving aboard U-155 during March 1943, kept a secret diary that survived the war. His entry from March 9th described an 8-hour depth charge attack while the boat ran at 290 meters. "We are deeper than the designer intended. The hull protests with every meter. Depth charges rain down but explode far above us. We can tell by the delay between splash and detonation. The commander is gambling that British weapons cannot reach at us." So far, he is correct. But each explosion overhead reminds us we are trapped in a steel tube beneath half a mile of ocean. If the hull cracks, water pressure will kill us instantly. If we surface, the destroyers will shell us. Our only hope is to outlast them, to remain here in the deep cold dark until their depth charges run out or their fuel runs low. Hours pass. Men soil themselves from fear but cannot leave their stations. The air grows foul. Carbon dioxide levels rise. We breathe in gasps. Still the boat holds. Still we live. Schaefer survived this attack and 9 others during U-155's patrol. His diary captures the paradox of deep-diving absolute terror combined with relative safety. The submarine was simultaneously in mortal danger from its own depth and protected from enemy weapons by that same depth. The Allied response to deep-diving U-boats evolved slowly, hampered by bureaucratic resistance and technical challenges. The first recognition of the problem came from operational commanders who noticed that depth charge attacks seemed less effective during late 1942. Escort captains reported submarines surviving attacks that should have been lethal. Captain Donald McIntyre, commanding HMS Hesperus, noted in his action report from February 1943, "Multiple attacks delivered on solid ASDIC contact failed to produce visible results. Post-attack ASDIC contact was lost, suggesting submarines survived and evaded at depth beyond our weapon settings." Similar reports accumulated through winter 1942 and spring 1943. The Royal Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division commissioned a study in January 1943 to analyze depth charge effectiveness. The results, delivered in March, confirmed what operational commanders suspected: standard depth charge settings were inadequate for submarines diving deep. The study recommended 3 immediate actions. First, increase maximum depth charge settings from 200 feet to at least 500 feet. Second, develop new weapons capable of reaching depths beyond existing limits. Third, revise tactical doctrine to account for deep diving targets. Implementation of these recommendations took months. The Mark 7 depth charge could be modified to detonate deeper by adjusting the hydrostatic pistol, but this modification required specialized equipment and trained armorers. Escort vessels couldn't perform the work at sea. Ships needed to return to port, offload their entire depth charge magazine, modify each weapon, then reload, a process requiring 3 to 4 days per vessel. The logistics were staggering. The Royal Navy had approximately 400 escort vessels in North Atlantic service. Each carried between 40 and 100 depth charges, depending on vessel size. Modifying this inventory required removing escorts from convoy duty, creating gaps in coverage that U-boats could exploit. Admiral Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, made the difficult decision to prioritize. Beginning in April 1943, escorts would be rotated through modification programs in batches. Priority went to vessels operating in areas where U-boat activity was highest, the central North Atlantic, and approaches to British ports. The modification program began on April 15, 1943. The first batch of 20 destroyers and corvettes entered port, offloaded depth charges, and received modified weapons set to 300 and 500-foot depths. These vessels returned to convoy duty by April 25th. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The impact was immediate and devastating for U-boats. On April 27th, HMS Duncan detected U-210 at periscope depth south of Iceland. The submarine, commanded by Oberleutnant Zur See Rudolf Lemke, immediately crashed Dove, reaching 280 meters within 2 minutes, a textbook execution of deep diving tactics. Duncan's captain, having just received modified depth charges, ordered a pattern with charges set to 300 feet. The attack was delivered exactly at U-210's depth. The explosions, occurring within 50 meters of the submarine, crushed the pressure hull. U-210 imploded at depth. No survivors. The sinking was not immediately recognized as significant. Escort commanders sank U-boats regularly, and one more loss didn't seem noteworthy. But over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. U-boats attempting to escape via deep diving were being destroyed at rates not seen in the war's first years. U-954 sunk May 19th. U-753 sunk May 23rd. U-418 sunk June 1st. Each boat followed standard deep diving procedures. Each was destroyed by depth charges set to reach them at extreme depth. The tactical advantage that had saved dozens of submarines over 6 months was evaporating. German naval intelligence initially missed the pattern. Individual boat losses were attributed to various causes: mechanical failure, bad luck, crew error. Not until late May 1943 did analysis of survivor reports reveal that Allied depth charges were now exploding at depths previously considered safe. Captain Lieutenant Peter Kramer, commanding O-333, was among the first to report the change. On May 13th, his boat came under attack from a British escort group south of Greenland. Kramer dove to 290 meters, expecting the depth charges to explode harmlessly above. Instead, explosions occurred at his exact depth, causing severe damage. Only skillful damage control saved the boat. Kramer's patrol report, filed after returning to base on May 27th, noted, "Enemy depth charges now detonate at depths exceeding 250 meters. The sanctuary we relied upon no longer exists. Recommend immediate revision of tactics." Admiral Dönitz, commanding the U-boat force, recognized the implications immediately. His war diary entry from May 29th stated, "Allied depth charges now reach depths previously safe. Our deep diving advantage has been neutralized. Boat losses will increase correspondingly." The prediction proved accurate. In June 1943, 24 U-boats were destroyed, many while attempting deep diving escapes. July brought 23 more losses. The survival rate for submarines caught by escorts dropped from 87% to 51%, a catastrophic deterioration. The advantage had lasted approximately 9 months, from November 1942 through May 1943. During that period, perhaps 200 U-boats had survived depth charge attacks by diving deep below weapon reach. Once Allied forces adjusted weapon settings, that advantage disappeared as rapidly as it had appeared. Klaus Zimmermann's second patrol aboard U-260, beginning June 10, 1943, illustrated the changed reality. During this patrol's first week, the submarine encountered a convoy escort group northwest of the Azores. Commander Perkhold, following established procedure, dove to 280 meters. The depth charges, when they fell, exploded at precisely that depth. The shock wave crushed U-260's stern section, flooding the aft torpedo room and engine compartments. The boat plunged toward the bottom, completely out of control. Only emergency blow procedures, executed with seconds to spare, brought the submarine back to the surface. U-260 surfaced directly among the escorts and came under immediate gunfire. Perkhold had no choice but to surrender. The crew abandoned ship. 41 men were rescued by HMS Duncan. 5 had died in the initial explosion. Klaus Zimmermann spent the rest of the war in a Canadian prisoner camp. His interrogation report, preserved in Allied naval archives, included this assessment. We had relied on diving deep to escape depth charges. For months, this tactic saved many boats. Then suddenly, the British depth charges began reaching us, even at 300 meters. The advantage we had enjoyed disappeared overnight. After that, every attack became potentially fatal. The temporary nature of the depth advantage reflected a broader pattern in the Battle of the Atlantic. Tactical advantages were fleeting, lasting only until the opponent recognized and countered them. Throughout the war's 5 years, both sides experienced cycles of advantage and response, measure and countermeasure, innovation and adaptation. German acoustic torpedoes were countered by Allied noisemakers. Allied centimetric radar was partially countered by German radar detectors. German snorkel technology was countered by Allied radar improvements. Each advantage provided a brief window of effectiveness before the opponent adapted. The depth charge story fit this pattern perfectly. Allied weapons, developed based on World War I experience, initially operated within depth parameters that German submarines exceeded. Once Allied forces recognized this gap and modified their weapons accordingly, the advantage disappeared. The human cost of this technological back and forth was measured in thousands of lives. The approximately 200 U-boats that survived attacks during the depth advantage period represented roughly 10,000 men who lived rather than died. Once that advantage ended, survival rates dropped accordingly, and casualties mounted. The physics of underwater explosions explains why depth provided such effective protection initially, and why deeper set depth charges proved so lethal once implemented. Water transmits shock waves efficiently, but not uniformly. Various factors affect shock wave propagation: temperature, salinity, depth, and the presence of thermal boundaries called thermoclines. A depth charge exploding in water creates a pressure bubble that expands rapidly, generating a shock wave traveling at approximately 4,800 feet per second, significantly faster than sound in air. This shock wave carries tremendous destructive energy. If it strikes a submarine's pressure hull directly, the force can crush the steel structure. However, shock wave intensity diminishes with distance according to inverse cube law. A charge exploding 100 feet from a submarine delivers roughly 1/8 the force of an identical charge exploding 50 feet away. This rapid energy dissipation means that depth charges must detonate relatively close to their targets to be effective. Vertical distance matters as much as horizontal. A depth charge set to explode at 200 feet, 60 meters, and actually detonating at that depth when a submarine runs at 300 meters, creates a vertical separation of 240 meters, roughly 780 feet. At that distance, even a charge exploding directly overhead delivers minimal destructive force. Additionally, thermal boundaries in the water bend shock waves, creating shadow zones where submarines can hide. The Atlantic Ocean typically features thermoclines layers, where temperature changes rapidly at depths between 100 and 200 meters. These boundaries partially reflect and refract shock waves, reducing their intensity below the layer. German submarine commanders learned to exploit thermoclines when possible, positioning their boats just below these thermal boundaries during attacks. Allied ASDIC sonar had difficulty maintaining contact through thermoclines, and depth-charge shock waves were weakened by passage through them. British scientist J.D. Bernal, working for the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, conducted extensive research into underwater explosion physics during 1942 and 43. His studies, classified until 1970, confirmed that standard depth charge settings were inadequate against deep-diving submarines. Bernal's research calculated that a 300-pound depth charge would need to explode within 65 feet of a submarine to guarantee destruction. At 100 feet distance, the charge might cause severe damage. At 200 feet, damage would be moderate. Beyond 300 feet, damage would be minor at best. These calculations assumed horizontal distance. When vertical separation was added, depth charges exploding at 60 meters when submarines ran at 300 meters, the total distance often exceeded 500 feet. At such ranges, even direct overhead hits posed minimal threat. Bernal's recommendations, delivered to the Admiralty in February 1943, called for immediate development of deeper set depth charges and eventually entirely new weapons. The modified Mark VII depth charges with 500-foot settings represented the quick response. Longer-term solutions would include the Mark X depth charge with 1,000-foot capability and the Squid forward-throwing weapon that could place charges precisely at target depth. The American Navy faced identical challenges in the Pacific Theater, where Japanese submarines occasionally employed deep-diving tactics. Lieutenant Commander William Roeder, serving as anti-submarine warfare officer for Commander Destroyers Atlantic, conducted parallel research to Bernal's work. Roeder's March 1943 report concluded, "Present depth charge settings are inadequate for targets below 250 feet. We estimate that 50% of attacks delivered against deep-diving submarines fail to cause significant damage due to insufficient weapon depth capability." American response followed the British pattern: modify existing weapons quickly while developing new systems for long-term replacement. The Mark IX depth charge, standard U.S. Navy weapon, could be modified to detonate at 500 feet with relatively simple pistol adjustments. This modification program ran parallel to the British effort, beginning in May 1943. The coordination between British and American anti-submarine efforts accelerated solutions to the deep-diving problem. Intelligence sharing meant both navies recognized the issue simultaneously and developed complementary responses. By July 1943, virtually all Allied escorts in the Atlantic carried at least some depth charges set to reach 300 feet or deeper. The tactical impact extended beyond simple weapon settings. Allied anti-submarine doctrine evolved to assume submarines would dive deep when attacked. Escort commanders began delivering attacks with deliberately scattered depth settings, some shallow for submarines remaining at moderate depth, some deep for boats attempting to escape below 250 meters. This mixed depth approach created three-dimensional kill zones that were far more difficult for submarines to escape. A U-boat commander could no longer simply dive below expected weapon depth and wait out the attack. Depth charges would explode throughout the water column, forcing submarines to evade in multiple directions simultaneously. HMS Starling, commanded by Captain Frederick Walker, pioneered these multi-depth tactics during spring 1943. Walker developed a technique called plaster, delivering continuous depth charge attacks over several hours, systematically covering different depth zones. The goal was not necessarily to sink the submarine with any single attack, but to maintain continuous pressure, preventing the boat from surfacing to recharge batteries or ventilate. On June 6, 1943, Starling detected U-202 southwest of Ireland and initiated a plaster attack that lasted 8 hours. Walker's action report described the methodology. First attack delivered with mixed depths, 150 to 350 feet. Second attack, all charges set deep, 400 feet. Third attack, mixed depths again. Maintained ASDIC contact throughout. Submarine, forced to remain submerged, slowly exhausting batteries. U-202 survived the initial attacks by diving to 300 meters, but continuous harassment prevented battery charging. After 8 hours, the boat's batteries were critically depleted. Air quality had deteriorated dangerously, and the crew was exhausted. Commander Oberleutnant Zur See Günther Poser had no choice but to surface. U-202 emerged directly in front of Starling's accompanying destroyers. Concentrated gunfire destroyed the submarine within minutes. Only 12 men survived from a crew of 49. Poser went down with his boat. The plaster technique and other multi-depth tactics transformed Allied anti-submarine warfare during summer 1943. Submarines could no longer rely on single tactical advantages, deep diving, silent running, thermal layer exploitation, because escorts now countered all these methods simultaneously. The cumulative effect was devastating for the U-boat force. In May 1943, 41 submarines were destroyed, Black May in German naval history. June brought 24 more losses. July, 23. The attrition rate had become unsustainable. Werner Henke, whose U-515 had exploited deep diving so successfully during winter patrols, discovered the changed reality during his third patrol in July 1943. On July 9th, the submarine attacked convoy OS-51 off West Africa, sinking 2 merchant ships before escorts responded. Henke executed his standard deep dive, reaching 310 meters within 90 seconds, a depth that had saved his boat multiple times previously. The pursuing escorts, including the destroyer HMS Woodpecker, delivered depth charges set throughout the water column. Several exploded within 100 feet of U-515 at depth, causing catastrophic damage. The boat's stern glands failed, flooding began in multiple compartments, and electrical systems short-circuited. Henke executed emergency blow procedures, surfacing the boat while escorts closed in. Unlike his previous escapes, this time the depth advantage had failed. U-515 survived only because Henke immediately surrendered, convincing Allied forces the boat was no longer a threat. The crew abandoned ship before scuttling charges detonated. Henke spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner in the United States. His interrogation reports, preserved in U.S. Naval archives, include extensive discussion of deep diving tactics and their failure once Allied depth charges reached extreme depths. The advantage lasted perhaps 6 to 8 months, Henke told interrogators in September 1943. During that time, diving below 250 meters provided good survival chances. Then suddenly, their depth charges began reaching us even at 300 meters. Once that happened, there was nowhere to hide. Henke's assessment was mathematically accurate. German naval records indicate that the average survival rate for U-boats caught by escorts peaked at 87% during the depth advantage period, roughly November 1942 through April 1943, then dropped to 51% after May 19, 43, once deeper set depth charges became standard. This 36 percentage point decline represented hundreds of additional casualties over the war's final 2 years. Had the depth advantage persisted, thousands of German submariners might have survived attacks that instead killed them once Allied weapons adjusted. The broader lesson extended beyond simple weapon settings. The depth charge story illustrated how warfare's outcome often hinges on technical details that seem trivial until their impact becomes apparent. The difference between a depth charge set for 200 feet versus 500 feet seems minor, a simple mechanical adjustment to the weapon's pistol mechanism. But that 300-foot difference created or eliminated a sanctuary zone where submarines could survive. In aggregate, across hundreds of attacks, it determined whether thousands of men lived or died. Modern anti-submarine warfare reflects lessons learned from these experiences. Contemporary depth charges, though largely replaced by more sophisticated weapons, are designed to reach maximum possible depths. No navy wants to create sanctuary zones where submarines can hide beyond weapon reach. The story of shallow-set depth charges also reveals how slowly military bureaucracies adapt to tactical realities. Allied forces possessed the technical capability to modify depth charge settings in 1942, when intelligence first indicated German submarines were diving deeper than anticipated. Yet the modification program didn't begin until April 1943, roughly 18 months after the problem became apparent. During those 18 months, hundreds of depth charge attacks failed because weapons couldn't reach their targets. Perhaps 50 to 100. U-boats survived attacks that should have destroyed them. Those boats went on to sink additional Allied merchant ships, prolonging the Battle of the Atlantic and costing Allied lives. The delay wasn't due to technical limitations, but institutional resistance. Senior officers doubted that submarines could operate at extreme depths. Scientific advisors insisted the physics made deep diving impossible. Bureaucratic procedures slowed intelligence dissemination from capture and interrogation to operational implementation. Only when mounting evidence became undeniable survivor reports, captured boats, technical intelligence, did the modification program begin. By that time, the tactical advantage had already saved numerous U-boats, allowing them to survive attacks and continue operations. Klaus Zimmermann, interviewed in Hamburg in 1987 at age 67, reflected on his wartime experiences with the detachment 4 decades provide. "We were young men playing a dead game with mathematics we barely understood. The ocean has physics. Depth charges have limitations. For a brief time, we understood these limits better than our enemies did. That knowledge saved many lives. German lives, yes, but also Allied lives, because boats that survived went home rather than sinking more ships." Zimmermann's observation hints at a counterfactual question historians have debated. Did the temporary depth advantage actually prolong the war by allowing U-boats to survive and continue operations, or did it paradoxically shorten the conflict by providing false confidence that made German submariners more aggressive, leading to eventual heavier losses? The statistical evidence suggests the latter. U-boats that successfully employed deep diving during late 1942 and early 1943 generally became more aggressive in their tactics, believing they had found a reliable escape mechanism. This aggression often led to situations where multiple escorts could coordinate attacks, eventually overwhelming even boats at extreme depths. U-260, Zimmermann's boat, exemplified this pattern. The successful first patrol in March 1943, where deep diving saved the boat repeatedly, encouraged Commander Perkhold to attempt increasingly risky attacks during the second patrol in June. One of these attacks brought the boat into contact with a well-equipped escort group that delivered precisely depth-set charges, ultimately destroying U-260. Had Perkhold been more cautious, maintaining distance from convoys, avoiding situations requiring deep escape dives, the boat might have survived longer. But the confidence born from the depth advantage encouraged aggressive action that eventually proved fatal. This psychological factor affected U-boat operations broadly during the period. Commanders who discovered the depth advantage often became more willing to press attacks, believing they possessed a reliable escape route. This tactical aggression placed their boats in more dangerous situations, ultimately contributing to higher loss rates once the advantage disappeared. The Allied technological response extended beyond simply deepening weapon settings. Scientists and engineers developed entirely new weapons designed specifically for deep-diving submarines. The squid forward-throwing weapon, entering service in summer 1943, represented a revolutionary approach. Rather than rolling depth charges off the stern after losing sonar contact, Squid fired 3 projectiles forward, while the attacking ship maintained continuous sonar tracking. Each projectile carried a larger explosive charge and could be set to detonate at any depth up to 900 feet. The system included an analog computer that automatically calculated target depth and weapon settings based on sonar data. Squid proved devastatingly effective. Ships equipped with the weapon achieved kill rates approaching 40% per attack, roughly 4 times better than conventional depth charges. The system eliminated the dead zone, where submarines previously escaped after ships lost sonar contact. HMS Loch Killin, fitted with Squid in March 1944, demonstrated the weapon's capabilities on July 31, 1944. The frigate detected U-333 north of Scotland and delivered a Squid attack while maintaining continuous sonar contact. The 3 projectiles exploded at precise depth, bracketing the submarine. U-333 was destroyed instantly. No survivors. By late 1944, the combination of deeper-set conventional depth charges and forward-throwing weapons like Squid had effectively eliminated depth as a reliable defense for submarines. U-boats could no longer dive below weapon reach. The sanctuary that had existed briefly in early 1943 was gone completely by early 1944. The cycle had completed. German submarines entered the war with advantages in Tactics and experience. Allied forces responded with improved detection technologies, ASDIC sonar, radar, radio direction finding. German forces partially countered these with deep diving when Allied weapons couldn't reach extreme depths. Allied forces then modified and replaced their weapons to reach any depth submarines could survive. By 1944, the technological balance had shifted completely to Allied favour. U-boats had no sanctuary, no depth they could reach that was safe from attack. Every patrol became a near-certain death sentence. Of the 40,000 men who served in German U-boats during the war, 28,000 died, a 70% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. Klaus Zimmermann's survival was statistically improbable. His capture in June 1943, while traumatic, likely saved his life. Men who remained aboard U-boats through 1944 faced odds approaching 90% fatality. The technological race had become so one-sided that continuing operations amounted to organized suicide. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.